I understand that the record is 25 hours. Thank you so much, Bruno. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. I will never have words to thank you enough for organizing this new, shiny, the whole Columbia community. Your Excellency, Senegalese Ambassador to the United Nations, Your Excellency, the General Consul of Senegal, I'm very, very honored that you have accepted Columbia invitation to be here and to represent our Senegalese community here in Senegal. Thank you very much. My dear colleagues, my dear friends, dear family, your presence at a time of turmoil in the world, in our Colombian community, touches me deeply. Thank you for being here. I was going to add, in spite of everything. But thank you for taking the time. And thank you to my departments of French and philosophy, to our dear Maison Française, and to the Institute of African Studies and every other institution here at Columbia, for having decided to make my retirement this occasion for a very timely celebration of what weaves us together as a community with continuity and resilience against all disruptions. Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece, and the father of Athenian democracy, famously declared that nobody could be called happy until they are dead. As a Spinozist, as I like to consider myself, I know nothing about death. I only talk about life. So my own paraphrase of the wise Solon will be as follows. A professor can be declared to have lived a happy academic life if, when he retires, he is surrounded by friends among the brightest minds in their disciplines, who are willing to share a moment of celebration, and for some of them, have a few words about his work. So here you are. Here you are. And the friendship you are showing me by your presence tells me that indeed my academic career is a happy one. During the coming couple of days, during each of the different panels, I will make sure to say a few words to thank each and every one of you, the panelists, but today I can only express in a very general way my gratitude to you, friends, colleagues, students, for everything my work and I personally owe you. And since they will not attend the panels, let me say now a few words to recognize my family, which is something that you wonderfully did already, Emmanuel. I will start in a very Senegalese Wolof traditional way with the child of my mother, my sister Ramatulai, who is also here as my colleague from the Department of Philosophy of Cheikh Anta Diop University. My wife's sister, Astuli, their big brother, Amadou Mahtarli, and our other family members, Souleymane Diop, Mohamed Mbodj, our nephew, Mustafa Wan, and my niece, Milan Sarr. I renew my gratitude to Shani, to Fanny, to you, Emmanuel, and all the organizers of this event for having accomplished a miracle that no holiday could accomplish. Have all my children decide that this is a time to buy plane tickets, fly home, since home is New York, and be with mom and dad. So thank you, Sheikh. Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you, Khadija. Thank you, Maimuna. Thank you, Abdallah. You have added to your carbon footprint, but it is for the good cause. Thank you for yet another manifestation of your love, and for continuously illuminating my life, and for being here with my grandchildren. Last but certainly not least, my wife, Mariam Lee, who has not only added my last name to the one she got from her father, but has also kidnapped my middle name, Bashir. Bashir is the adjective corresponding to the noun Bushra, meaning happy news. Well, that name Bashir suits you perfectly, Mariam Bashir. And I'm blessed to have you by my side as a permanent and ever new Bushra. Let me now have my head talk praising the universal before I pour too much from my heart. I taught my first class as a not yet tenured associate professor at the University of Dakar on October 1982. It was room 76 that a few of you know very well here. The course was on the history of logic, from Leibniz to Frege. And actually, this is a class I have had the pleasure of co-teaching here at Columbia with Achille Barzi. On that first day of my first academic year, I presented to my Senegalese students Les Nouveaux Essais sur l'Entendement Humain, the new essays on human understanding by Leibniz. And I discussed with them the goal of the philosopher to reconstruct the Adamic language that all human beings spoke before the curse of Babel happened, fragmenting humanity into tribes with different languages. And I'm looking at Christia, my very dear colleague from the philosophy department, who is this huge specialist of Leibniz, and it has been my pleasure, dear Christia, to talk about Leibniz and many other things with you. Leibniz, as I explained that day, believed in the construction of a universal Adamic language of algebraic logic that will be the pure language of our faculty of understanding when it is not obfuscated by the noise of our imagination or our passions. Through the reconstruction, first by Leibniz, then by George Boole, of that primal language spoken by all humans before the catastrophe of Babel, and which Leibniz called a lingua characteristica universalis, I have devoted my dissertation and my first two books exploring the history of the algebra of logic, which is the origin of our computer civilization, which is the origin of the binary system 0 and 1, which is the alphabet of our computers. Academic life has later led me from that consideration of the pure universal symbolism of computing to the question of the universal when considering the irreducible thickness of the different languages that we do speak, which are imperfect in that they are many, as French poet Stéphane Mallarmé famously said. The question I came to consider then could be posed as follows. What universal language after Babel? And the answer I have been exploring is the following: a universal of translation or a lateral universal, to evoke a concept coined by French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And I've been a happy co-teacher again many times with Peter Connor, my good friend and colleague Peter Connor, of a graduate seminar on translation studies. And dear Hamid Dabashi, we still have to co-teach a class. So now that I am kicked out of Columbia, you will have to invite me to your seminar, and I will be happy to say a few words, and we will be fulfilling the promise we made to each other to co-teach a class. Translation is a machine de guerre against cultural apartheid. We establish a cultural apartheid when we consider that cultures are insularities, that our different experiences are incommunicable singularities. Apartheid, as its etymology indicates, insists on frontiers with the idea that cultures must be protected from each other, or cultural appropriation will occur. When we understand cultures and identities in that way, public space is no longer public space. It is no longer an agora for dialogue and exchange. It becomes a place for juxtaposed performances of identities. And we would live then in a Babylonian world of tribes where untranslatability reigns. In the oblivion of the line by the playwright Terence from the 2nd century BC, Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puto. I am human. I consider nothing human alien to me. A declaration that has become the motto of humanism. Against such a vision goes Walter Benjamin's notion of translation as the path to what he calls the pure language, which can be understood as the universal Adamic mother tongue. In his famous essay, The Task of the Translator, Benjamin explains the encounter with such a pure language, the intuition, the presentiment that the translation experiences when she gives hospitality in one language to what has been thought and created in another. That virtual third language that presents itself and exists only in that moment and in that experience of translating is the language of our shared humanity. This is the topic of my book, From Language to Language, The Hospitality of Translation, that Emmanuel has mentioned, and so did Bruno, which I was going to present it to you because it is imminent that it comes out. But we did not get copies on time. But I'm delighted to say that it has been translated from the French original by Dylan Temmel, an alum from our French department, and the students that I have been blessed to have in my classes. The experience, the best experience I had during this career is that 3 times my work has been translated by my own student. And I did not even know they had that in mind. My first book translated into English was translated by Chike Jeffers, who could not be with us here. And just one day I received an email with an attachment from him. And I started reading the attachment. I say, this sounds familiar. And it was pages from my book in English. This is what Chike did that day. Same thing with Dylan also. He did not even dare ask me. He went through Fanny, who told me, you know what, Dylan would like to translate your book. And since I mentioned in my book that the best idea of translation, the ethics of translation, is when you fall in love with something and you feel compelled to translate it, I could not but say to him, yes, indeed. And I was happy to be able to convince Judith Gurevich to just drop her professional translators and ask Dylan to do it, and he did a wonderful, wonderful job. Having talked about Babel, I cannot resist reading from the biblical narrative of the catastrophe of Babel in Genesis 1:9. Preaching the Bible has been always my dream. Thank you for making it possible. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. This condemnation marks the end of the Adamic language and represents a new fall for the human being after the first one that took him out of the Edenic state he first enjoyed. Babel stands for the ontological loss that is the fall of humans into the plurality of innumerable different languages, into the many nations of tribes that we constitute. Beyond this, its religious significance, this story speaks to us of our human condition, which is the plural face we give to it through the plural of our languages. And by the way, there is also a scientific, secular version of the story told by our colleague here at Columbia, linguist John McWhorter, in his wonderful book, The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language. Here is what he writes. I quote John McWhorter. The process by which one original language has developed into 6,000 is a rich and fascinating one, incorporating not only findings from linguistic theory, but also geography, history, and sociology. It is this fascination, he says in his introduction, this fascinating story that I will share with you in this book. The question the Babel myth poses is how we can speak the same language without using the same tongues. In other words, how we can ensure that the plurality of our languages, which is also the plurality of our perspectives on the world, does not fragment our humanity into tribes. There is a thesis implicit in George Steiner's classical work on the philosophy of translation and the title After Babel. What this title says is that embracing our post-Babel condition, like Sisyphus embraced his rock, we can turn around our condemnation by God and transform our dispersion in different languages into their encounter in translation. Translation will then be the common language. Umberto Eco spoke of translation as the language of Europe, but Ngugi wa Thiong'o has spoken of translation as the language of languages, more universal. It is in this sense that translating to overcome the multiplicity, synonymous with confusion, of our languages becomes an ethical project. After Babel starts the task of the translator, to take up here the message of an exhibition on translation that was presented by Barbara Cassin at Marseille's Museum 8 years ago now, under the title Après Babel, traduire. After Babel, well, translation. The theme around which this exhibition was organized was that of a reversal of Babel that transforms what was a curse into a mission and a task. The ethical mission to achieve humanity as a task and a responsibility after humanity as a natural given has been lost in tribal fragmentation. And this is one of the reasons why Ubuntu, as you said, Emmanuel, is at the heart of my work. I love this word, this first, that human is not a given, it's not a state, it is a task. Humanity is something we have to achieve. To be human is to have the responsibility of becoming who we have to be, achieving our toti and einai, as Aristotle said in Greek. And second component, achieving humanity means achieving it together, in reciprocity, not in the isolation of your own chamber in a Cartesian way when you find out that I think, therefore I am, but in the reciprocity, in relationship, in intersubjectivity. So we achieve our humanity, we have to achieve it, and we have to achieve it together. So I have two comments about this ethical mission here. The first one gets me back to the religious texts. I noted that the biblical description of a humanity scattered over the face of the earth by the plurality of its languages is also Quranic. Actually, normally the Quran, usually the Quran has the same narratives that you find in the Bible, but not for the Babel narrative. Still, this notion of our human condition being a post-Babelian condition is present, and I'm thinking here, for example, of a verse from the Quran that says this: "We have made you nations and tribes so that you may know one another." So while there is no Babel narrative in the Quranic text, the notion expressed in this verse of humanity's fragmentation into tribes and therefore into languages goes in the same direction. Whether original or post-Babelic, our dispersion in the Babel of languages is a given. But what is added by the Quranic verse is that with it also comes the task of knowing each other, of achieving humanity together through the language of languages, that is translation. My second remark is that things are obviously not so simple. And if we look at history, we can see everything that can stand in the way of this reversal, and one could say against the optimism or maybe naivete of my title about hospitality of translation, that actual relations between languages are much more characterized by cultural hegemony than by what I have presented as a humanism of translation. Within Europe itself, the hierarchy of languages according to their genius has been the subject of debate, as we know from the famous question posed in 1783 by the Berlin Academy, to which Rivarol responded with his famous speech on the genius of the French language, which makes it universal, and more universal than German. I don't know what my good friend Andreas would say about that. But it was colonialism that transformed the claim to universality of certain languages into the reality of their imperial status. In this respect, colonialism has reproduced the great division made by the Greeks between their language, which was the logos in person, and those of the barbarian words, whose confusion or babble mirrored the one reigning in their minds. Achille Mbembe has rightly written that colonialism is monolingual. In other words, it is only natural that it should see its language as the tool for the moral conquest that alone can consolidate and perpetuate the colony's physical conquest. Moral conquest is the title given by Georges Hardy, the young and enthusiastic director of l'enseignement en Afrique occidentale française, to the book he published in 1917, in which he indicated that the language of the colonial school would be the best tool for assimilating the races that, he said, chance has entrusted to us. Assimilate them, in other words, take them out of the bubble to which they are confined, not only by their native languages, but also by the language of their Quranic school, if they are Muslims. It is no coincidence, then, that so many works of Francophone African literature have as their theme the so-called French school and its symbolic violence against traditional or Quranic education in Africa or elsewhere. One model of such novels is Cheikh Hamidou Kant's literary classic, L'Aventure ambiguë. Post-colonial vigilance, or can I say wokeness without lightning striking Columbia once again, calls the attention to the fact that there is a question of power at the heart of translation, and that in the context of colonialism particularly, we are dealing not with the equivalence of languages in translation, but with a master language and a servant language. In other words, with the logos of a colonizer and the dialect of a colonized subject. The post-colonial turn in translation theory means that the need to look at the colonial encounter and examine the imbalance between the languages and cultures that are communicating through translation, bringing to light that cultural hegemony lies at the heart of translation also. That translation is primarily the translation by the colonizer of the dominated culture of the colonized. The figure of the ethno-linguist cannot be detached here from the colonial context. It is the case that Europe's universalism means its unquestioned capacity to translate other cultures into its own language. Thus, Emmanuel Levinas writes in Humanism of the Other that, I quote, "The decried Western civilization knew how to understand cultures that never understood anything about themselves." The Levinas of totality and infinity, the Levinas that we love, is also the Levinas who wrote Humanism of the Other, where he just praised the exceptionalism and universalism of Europe and had to say that European universalism is founded upon the notion that Western civilization is not one among others, a language among languages, but the Logos itself. Europe, for him, simply cannot be a province of the world. Let's Depeche know that. Thanks to its verticality, and Levinas insists that verticality is a sine qua non of universality, European humanity, as Husserl called it, is naturally endowed with the anthropological vocation to understand particular cultures that never understood themselves. Therefore, it should not even need to formally colonize other people, because, as Levinas writes, culture and colonization do not necessarily go together. Central to the post-colonial turn in translation studies is the thesis that colonialism in essence is translation. That colonialism itself is a translation project is the demonstration which is conducted in the influential work by Tejaswini Niranjana, citing translation, history, post-structuralism, and the colonial context. So the question is translation in essence colonialism? It is through translation that what Congolese-American Valentin Mudimbe has called the colonial library is constituted. And when the colonized subjects themselves engage in the translation of their cultures and imaginaries into the imperial language, they are only adding to that colonial library. They are willing to serve the master and betray the culture that they are translating. In this case, translation is consent to colonialism, and the Italian proverb traduttore traditore, translation is betrayal, then conveys a more sinister meaning than the simple one it playfully suggests, namely that one has to cope with the fact that there is no absolute equivalence from language to language. In this context, the translator is accused of being either a dupe or a traitor. On this topic, there is an important essay by Mahasweta Sengupta about self-translation by the colonized. In her essay entitled Translation as Manipulation, The Power of Images and the Images of Power, she studies Rabindranath Tagore's self-translation of his work from Bengali into English and concludes that in the process, the poet manipulates his own poetry in order to suit the expectations of the colonizer's language. He manipulates because fundamentally he is manipulated by colonialism when he engages in the task of translating, into inventing in the sense that Mudimbe gives to the invention of Africa, into inventing himself as the figure of the saint from the East at a time of turmoil that was World War I. And in an important book that can be considered post-colonial, Pascal Casanova alludes to that study of Tagore in her work, La langue mondiale, traduction et domination. We cannot ignore that we have the hierarchy between what she calls hypercentral languages, central languages, and peripheral languages, questioning the equivalence of languages that are put in touch, to use Antoine Berman's phrase, or in a relationship of hospitality, as I say, following Paul Ricoeur. One translates up when one translates from a peripheral to a central language. I would translate up if I have my book translated by my good friend Dylan into English, but why would I translate into Wolof? This is particularly the case, she writes, in a situation of coloniality, characterized by diglossia, the co-presence of two languages, the central one or hypercentral one, colonial, and the often peripheral idiom of the native, a situation that is in an obvious manifestation of cultural domination. There is a certain difference between bilingualism, meaning that a subject masters two languages that can be considered equivalent, and diglossia, which is the situation of a community formally or actually dominated. In such a situation, the two languages are not equivalent. One, the imperial one, is the prestige language, while the use of the other, the indigenous one, is often confined to private interactions. In a situation of diglossia, to translate the poetry, the imaginary of one's culture into the imperial language is to translate up. And that is why self-translation inevitably marks submission and surrender to colonialism. Now, I have mentioned all these aspects of the post-colonial turn in translation studies to insist that I am not naive. and to insist that I do realize that humanism, or the universal, or hospitality of translation, in my work, sound out of sync, to say it mildly, with post-colonial or decolonial thought. Right from its title, my book seems to run counter to the lessons from such a post-colonial turn in the field of translation studies. Of course, speaking of hospitality brings to mind, in the French context, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur or the philosopher Antoine Bergman, whose works are in the continuity of a tradition of philosophy and ethics of translation inaugurated by German thinkers Goethe, the Romantics, for example, Friedrich Schleiermacher. My point is that the politics, the anthropology, and the sociology of translation are not counterexamples to the ethical project that translation is. My book and my position are in continuity with that tradition of the ethical project of translation and do run counter a form of post-colonial ideology of a radical incommensurability and untranslatability of cultures, of identities, and languages. More generally, my thinking goes against certain binary simplifications that are sometimes presented as post-colonial, in particular, incommensurability against translation or particularism against the universal. What we learn from the politics and sociology of translation in a post-colonial approach, namely that all languages are not equal, does not negate the ethical and philosophical truth of translation as hospitality, and that languages are equivalent in translation. Translation creates equivalence, and in that sense, it is a humanism. In other words, I do acknowledge and recognize the sociological political approach. At the same time, I'm saying that if I do something that phenomenologists would call an epoche, bracketing out the context in order to look at the significance of just putting in touch two languages, then I am thinking about the ethical project that translation is, and then I am thinking of the humanism of translation. Translation is a figure of what I call, following Merleau-Ponty, a lateral universal. Humanity as the first universal is what I explore in Universaliser l'humanité par des moyens d'humanité, to universalize humanity by means of humanity. By the way, this is a quote from the founder of French socialism, or Socialist Party, which becomes both the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, Jean Jaurès, identifying the combat for humanity to the true significance of socialism. That would be the political import of what I'm trying to do. Immanuel Wallerstein, an alumni of Columbia, who in his own words decided to make Africa the focus of his intellectual concerns, and who presided the African Studies Association in 1973, has declared that our times mark the end of European universalism. He has added that that means we are now facing the task of forging a truly universal universal. I consider that to mean what French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty has called a lateral universal. And now I quote Merleau-Ponty directly. Here is what he says: "The equivalent of our social being can be dismantled and reconstructed by the voyage, as we are able to learn to speak other languages. This provides a second way to the universal, no longer the overarching universal of a strictly objective method, but a sort of lateral universal, which we acquire through ethnological experience and its incessant testing of the self through the other person, and the other person through the self." In his work, Humanism of the Other, Emmanuel Levinas mocked, literally, this concept of a lateral or horizontal or diagonal universal as oxymoronic. In his view, the universal can only be understood at the verticality of a European orientation of the word. But that universalism, as Bruno has mentioned in his generous introduction, has ended with the Bandung Conference of 1955. The importance of that meeting is that it is the symbol of decolonization, even if the movement of decolonization obviously had already started. India, Pakistan, China, many countries were already independent at that day. The conference, not called by Europe and held in the absence of Europe, showed the configuration of a world in which Europe is no more the center, and which is that of the eruption on the scene of universal history, in Hegel's sense, of the pluralism of the world. Now, what the lateralism or the multilateralism of the universal says is that all cultures, all languages are all equivalent, all on the same plane of immanence, and equally invited to the elaboration of that truly universal. And that is the significance of the Bandung Conference. The Senegalese Alioune Diop, founder of the Présence Africaine publishing house, put it perfectly. To decolonize, he says, is not to decolonize against the universal, but to universalize. Décoloniser pour universaliser, he said. And he added, in order to universalize, it is crucial that all are present to the task of achieving humanity. Following Alioune Diop, I have chosen the verb and not a substantive in the subtitle of my book, Universaliser l'humanité par des moyens d'humanité. The verb indicates that the universal is a practice of universalizing, and that is what the 3 points made by Merleau-Ponty quote express, that I'm going to go through very quickly now in order to conclude. First, multilingualism or heteroglossia. The possibility of moving and thinking from language to language is an exercise in decentering. To engage in universalizing is like learning to speak other languages. It does not mean just adding, juxtaposing, or piling up languages that are external to one another, but it means more deeply broadening the experience of stepping outside oneself and seeing oneself and one's language through the eyes of another. The incessant testing of oneself by the other and of the other by oneself echoes here the title of Antoine Berman's book, L'épreuve de l'étranger, the test of the foreign. Second, the incessant testing means that there is always misunderstanding and untranslatability. Translation has also to deal with untranslatability. It is not the violence of assimilating the other, reducing the difference of the other to my own language. Because different languages are different perspectives on the word, different ways of being inscribed in the very flesh of the word, as phenomenologists say, translating, says Ricoeur, is both an impossible and a sublime task. Impossible because it brings together different experience of the word, making the task of translating always at the same time a work of mourning for what has not been able to make the crossing from a language to another in its original form. And the translation is sublime because it eventually always happens, the welcoming into one language of what has been thought and created in another language. Despite the heterogeneity of idioms, there are bilinguals, there are polyglots, there are interpreters, and there are translators. And all these people carry the message using Edouard Glissant's language that to translate is to open up to one another the opacities that cultures are. Important to mention that they are opacities. They cannot be just assimilated into an homogeneous word, but they are open opacities, as Glissant forges this concept. Third, to say that each human experience conveyed by a given language can enter into a broader experience, in principle accessible to people from another country and another time, is to say that what enables and promotes such accessibility is our shared human condition. It is to reaffirm against a prison-like conception of identity these words by the Senegalese poet and thinker Léopold Sédar Senghor, inviting to always, I quote, measure the pride of being different against the happiness of being together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There are mics that are circulating, and I will